Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm BJ Miller. Welcome to our very first, what to call this? This is the first of what will be a series, a monthly series, a joint project between between Mettle Health and the Center for Dying and Living, our nonprofit, what will someday be a sort of repository of information, a library, and a place to come together. Community builder, we'll see. So this is our first in a series. It's meant to be something between group therapy, I suppose, and information, and a way to connect with each other this way, but also potentially across peer-to-peer. So we'll see. Those are our intentions. We thought we'd kick off with grief because it's really up for many of us right now. So why don't we I'm going to just sort of lay out the structure a little bit. So I'll run through a few slides just to kind of, level set and set a sort of tone for us. And then I'll say a few things about grief in general, just to set the table. But then pretty quickly, the hope here is to open up to conversation. That's really what this is meant to be. This is not a lecture. So Sonia Dolan is my partner in all this, and she's behind the scenes helping me navigate this thing. And bear with us. This is a little bit awkward because we're trying to figure out the apparatus as well as a format. But good thing I love awkward. Awkward is tender and sweet. But anyway, Sonia's in the background. As questions come up, or thoughts, or anything you want to share with the group, this is meant to be an intimate conversation, really, guys. The subject matter begs of it, and there are folks in the audience who are acutely grieving. So kindness is the thing, safety is the thing, and honoring and respecting privacy here as well. So let's try to keep this kind and intimate and a safe place. So comments and questions along the way. When I'm done with my little spiel, we'll jump in, and then Sonia can hit a little. You'll be able to hit the little question, the raise your hand icon, and then we'll go through you guys one at a time, and everyone who wants to speak can speak. Okay. So there in the background, you should see my slides now. I want to just basically run through some images. I'm going to shut up and not say anything. Let's just get in the mood. Okay. Well, so grief, I'm assuming we all probably know this, but the grief is normal. It's one thing to say. I think it's important to realize that there's some inertia, the way medicine treats grief, and the way society at large treats grief. Here in the West, I think most of us experience that grief is something that you're allowed for a moment or two, some amount of sadness and distraction, but then pretty quickly we're expected to get back on the horse, as it were. And those of us who've actually grieved know that just doesn't work that way. I'm not sure that grief ever ends. But for my money, I think grief, okay, while it's normal and part of the human experience, what is it? Well, I think of it as the sort of process by which we humans metabolize loss. It's the way we digest reality, and the way we move from one view of reality that's had to shift by virtue of loss. And the grief helps us segue to a new reality, a new frame, and somehow allows, if we allow ourselves to grieve, what we're doing is we're making that loss part of our lives, an active relationship. I think that's a really, really key distinction. For me, in my own grieving, I thought it was something that I would, early on, I thought it was something that I could just hold my breath and get through and be done with. I realized that A, that's not really possible, and B, I wouldn't want it to be possible, because there's nothing saying we have to really let go of the things we've lost. They're in us. I think we have to segue to a different relationship or a different dynamic with the folks and the things we lose, but they're in us, in our memory, in our bones. So grief is that process that makes that, allows for that to happen. And I think it's incredibly uncomfortable at times and odd. I think of it as really is a process in which you're actually altered. And I think societies, cultures that have embraced grief and have ritualized it, one of the common themes is not much is expected of folks who are in mourning, because you're discombobulated and necessarily. And so you're not asked to necessarily be acting normal per se. That's why I love cultures that mark grief with clothing or an armband or some way to note that this grief is happening, so handle with care. The other thing to appreciate about grief is it can be big and small. Personally, I've lost limbs, I've lost my sister, and I realized if I just look at my own response, the sensations that I have around those losses, they're not terrifically different from other losses that I've had in my life that seem smaller or less significant. I think the adjectives, the significances, the hierarchies we apply to our losses and to our sufferings, that's all made up. You don't have to do that. In some way, loss is loss. And we don't need to compare whose loss is bigger. I've done that with myself. It's a dead end. So a couple other things to appreciate about grief. And I'm a physician, right? And so I work within the medical model, but I'm a big fan of straddling to the world outside of the medical model. But I have some real respect for it too. And one of the things that we'll learn from psychology and from mental health, but also from the medical world, we grieve in anticipation of loss even. So one of the things that's been very helpful for me to talk with families about is just to note, like I'll talk to a couple and they're talking about preparing for the eventual death of someone who's dealing with a diagnosis. And they'll note a real moodiness and a difficulty dealing with daily life. And it's most of the time folks don't realize that they're already in grief because the loss ostensibly hasn't happened yet. But really the loss begins the moment we can conceive of it. And there are other active losses. Even after the time of a diagnosis, your roles may change, your identity may change. And even though you're not dead, you may have had a part of you has maybe gone. And so there's real grief just at the time of diagnosis, even before the loss. And the phrase we use for this is anticipatory grief. And I think it's a really important thing to understand so you can sense of what's going on in you. Because otherwise it's like, what's wrong with me? My husband's still here. Why am I so sad that he's going to die? He's still here. I'm not enjoying him. Why? Well, that's anticipatory grief. And it's totally normal. And then the other thing sort of on our level setting and boundaries here are sort of putting some borders on this. Grief, like we said earlier, probably doesn't really ever end. It's this ongoing process. And when we start taking into account the connections, the degrees of connections we have with one another and the world around us, especially nowadays through technology, we're aware of news across the world that might be devastating. We may be grieving losses that aren't really impacting our daily lives, but which we're aware of. So you start thinking about, we're probably in some amount of grief all the time. All the more reason why it's important that we all come to some sort of thoughtful relationship with this process. And in so many ways, it's a beautiful process because it means that you love. you know, one way you could sidestep the pain of grief is to not love anything or anyone in the first place. I really don't recommend that. But I do think it's really powerful if you can equate love with grief. You can see the relationship between the two. And in this way, grief becomes a little less obnoxious. And sometimes grief can get really obnoxious to the point where it's out of control, it's out of hand. And grieving isn't just when the grief becomes its own sort of pathology, its own illness, we call that complicated grief. And this is more common in sudden losses, in violent losses, in losses where there was no reconciliation before the death, in folks who have issues with substance use, and depression, of course, that can kick us into a more complicated grief. And the significance of noting complicated grief is that it really means you need help, usually professional help. It starts becoming the problem in of itself. It's not the way to just mark and denote and ritualize the problem or the loss. It becomes the problem. And at this point, psychotherapy and even medications can become important. So it's something to be aware of. I mentioned this already, but I think this tie-in is so key. It helped me so much when I reluctantly came to try to address grief rather than hold my breath. And when I realized it was connected to love, then somehow I was much more interested in it. So I think that's plenty in terms of commentary for me. That should sort of set the table for us, I think. So what I'd like to do, guys, is cut to you all. So if you are able, type in your question on the little control panel, this GoToWebinar. You should see a line that says questions with a little arrow next to it. You can type in a question there, and question's probably the wrong word. Anyone who wants to comment or share their ideas or experience of grief, or just share their active grief with us, this should be a safe place to do so, to be witnessed. And if you don't want to deal with a question, you can just raise your hand too. So, okay, you guys, I don't see anyone coming up with the question just yet, which is just fine. I'll leave this slide up in the background for you so you know how to reach us. But while anyone's thinking about commenting, let me make sure I'm not missing anything here, guys. Again, thank you for your forbearance on the technology. Okay, well, here's a question. Thank you, they're coming in. I won't mention names, and I'll just leave it as from the questions. And if you guys want to talk, and besides just me responding to a question, raise your hand and then introduce yourself, and we'll talk, and then you can do the talking. But let me address this first question. Can you talk about families co-grieving? Yeah, it's a really important thing. It turns out, of course, none of us is in a vacuum. We all operate within groups and systems. We're social critters. And families often go through losses together, loss of a loved one, loss of a pet, loss of anything, a home. The thing about grief, though, it's not an orderly process. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave us the stages of grief, which generally hold together pretty well. But the important thing is they're not linear. You don't sort of stepwise go through this process, one emotion to the next. It's much more free-flowing than that. So coordinating grief between people, even close people, can be really tricky. One day you may be up, the other person may be down. Someday you both might be down, and it's just neither of you can be helpful to the other. Whatever it may be, it can get tricky, co-grieving. And then if you're not careful, depending on family dynamics, people can start competing in a way with their grief. Whose grief is bigger? Whose demands more attention, etc. I think the key here is with co-grieving is just to name it, and communication becomes really key, and patience and kindness become really key. You can't force grief. You can't systematize it too much. So just let it flow, and beg for space from the people you know and love, and ask and give them the same. You just need. A stark example for me was at this funeral of my sister, and as it was, I was so embarrassed. We were lowering her casket into the ground, and I started laughing. I'm not sure it was laughter, but it sounded like laughter, and then I couldn't stop it. I felt so embarrassed, as you can imagine. There was nothing, obviously nothing funny about it, but I just, in a moment, was struck as how absurd this all was, and that's what came out of me. I had no control over it. And so what I really needed that moment was patience and understanding, not to be taken so literally. And I got that just intuitively from people. So I think this is why it's so important to note grief, because then you can craft space, people can give you space. If you don't name grief, you just sound like you're moody and you're all over the place and you can start stepping on toes. Take advantage of the cover of grief. We should give that to each other. Okay. Next question here is, can you talk more about the markings of grief, like wearing a black armband? What cultures do this well? So beautiful, right? This is where palliative care is so great in a lot of ways. It's a way to upload non-medical issues into the medical system, spiritual issues, social issues, cultural issues, and those are some of my favorite. And to note that as a field, we're dramatically underdeveloped. There's so much good work to be done. And loss is ancient. So cultures have been doing this for a long, long time. So one of these days, maybe get a little scholarship and we'll go write a big paper on this and study this. But what I can say is, in the Jewish tradition, there has been there's sitting Shiva, and there's been sometimes it lasts a year where you wear some sort of armband that denotes that you are in grief, and that people will afford you space accordingly and check in on you and not expect too much of you. Usually, in my understanding, that goes about a year. I've heard of some cultures doing something like that for closer to 2 years. There's the veritable hanging crepe, which is just putting some black crepe in the windows so passersby in the community know, okay, this is a house touched by grief. Let's be thoughtful, let's be respectful. And absent here in the US, we're happily a very mixed culture. We're not a monolithic culture. So a lot of folks who are removed from their traditions and the rituals of their family lives, now they live across the country or across the world, or maybe they were raised in a spiritual tradition and have left that as an adult. But one way or another, this is some ripe territory for us as a group, for us as people, to begin to reacquaint ourselves with grief and mark it. So absent any rituals that you are already baked into your life, you can create them. You can create them. I've worked with some patients who have put a brooch on, and when someone asks them about the brooch, it's a conversation starter, and they'll say, well, this is my touchstone. I actually lost someone very close to me recently, and blah, blah, blah. And it becomes a touchstone for them and an interesting piece for people to ask about and engage around. It lacks the understanding in a culture that is talking to each other. It lacks the built-in symbolism, but you can supply that. So I really strongly recommend that you do. Some folks or families have made T-shirts that commemorate a phrase or something about the loved one, and they wear that T-shirt a lot, and that sends a signal. So absent any traditions that are baked into your world, make them up and then communicate them. Here's the next question.
Quick question, sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you. This is Sonia here. I just want to get to some of the raised hands that have been up for a little while. Susan, if you still have a question, I'm going to unmute you, question or comment, and then just go ahead. Looks like you're still muted, Susan. You might have to unmute yourself on your end. Okay, Susan, I'm going to mute you again real quick, and then we'll try again. Let me get to another person here. Looks like Terrell, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering anyone's name. I'm going to unmute you if you have a question or comment. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Max, but I'm on I'm on my wife's.
Oh, hi, Max.
It's fine. So my wife's name is Terrell. Just a quick. So I'm dealing with. So I'm 50. I'm dealing with stage 4 cancer diagnosis, and when you mentioned the anticipatory grief, that really struck a chord with me, and you know what we're going through right now, and so I just wanted to let you know that really, I could really feel that, and it just kind of, as a piece as far as what's going on. And just part of that is, I've been an active, fit, healthy person, for my whole life, and I've been having to say goodbye to, parts of my life, and that's been really that's been a real challenge as someone who, has been, an active person, and in lots of ways, and so just I don't know, not so much a question, just as more just a reality, and I guess I'm interested in hearing more about kind of techniques or ideas about around anticipatory grief.
Mhm.
Thanks,
Well,
Max.
Max, thank you. And have you noticed so far in your own wanderings with grief, has anything in particular helped you? Is there anything to share?
I guess just being aware of it and giving voice to it, with my friends, and with my wife, that, as hard as it is, sometimes it's unavoidable, just when it comes up, and comes up in different ways, it's sadness, it's anger, it's uh, it's a real touchy area. It's not an area I'm used to being in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Thank you, Max. I really appreciate your comments. I don't know how you feel about this, but in some ways, I know when I'm in grief or working with people who are, it's an extremely tender zone. It feels like your skin is, it feels like you can feel exposed in a way.
Yeah.
And um, I wonder what you think, Max. For myself, I have come to really love and honor that tenderness because actually, to me, that feels like such a truthful place because life is really hard. Love is really, really tricky, as wonderful as it is. Loving life is actually hard to do. I feel always, very close to a line of I've had enough, and then minutes later I'm ready to try again. And it is amazing that we're all on the same planet at the same time. And it's I think life is much more exquisite and much more beautiful than most of us are able to allow in one day to the next, 1 hour to the next. And so I guess I say all that to say it feels to me like what you are in a very truthful place. And rather than you trying to kind of meet the world where it's hanging out, I sure wish the world made better space for this kind of tenderness. I've watched. I just want to note it so we can honor it, but also to hold on to it. One thing I've noticed is oftentimes after loss, the grieving period, there's that tenderness that you're describing, and then the window starts to close and back to sort of real life in some ways, or whatever it is, muscle memory pulls us out of that tender place, and it feels like an opportunity is lost. So I guess the challenge of what I'm posing here, Max, would be to think about ways to love this tender place, as painful as it can be, because it's so dang truthful and it's so exquisite. And I wonder if there's a way to actually love it for all that, and to find ways to bring people into that tenderness rather than you trying to quickly scar back down again so you can, tolerate daily life. I don't know if any of that sounds reasonable, but I think your first point of just being aware of it is step one, just self-awareness, so you know why you feel the way you do. And oftentimes too, especially with anger, we can accidentally hurt others with our anger that's not really meant for them. So this is where just being self-aware is so key, and also such an act of kindness. I don't know if that registers with you, pal, but those are some thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that all totally makes sense. And, I know, I've done years of therapy, in the past, and I've kind of repicked it back up again just because of this. And yeah, I'm in some ways very comfortable being in a vulnerable place, and a large part of that is thanks to having done some good therapy over the years. Vulnerability isn't a taboo, in my world. So, it's not always easy either. There's lots of triggers, but no, I really appreciate your response to that, and your openness to hear it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us, Max. Solidarity with you, brother. But thank
All
you.
right, thank you.
Thanks, Max.
Sonia,
So it
more.
looks like we have one other raised hand we could get to before we get to questions. Does that sound good, BJ?
Yep.
Okay, great. And I'm sorry, Dana or Dana, I am not sure which ones you'll tell us once we unmute you. If you have a question or comment, I'm going to unmute you now. Looks like,
Oh,
there
okay.
you are.
Hi, I'll try to articulate this the best that I can. I wasn't exactly planning on sharing, but here it is. I lost my father about 3.5 years ago, and I am still in grief. Maybe it's complicated grief. I've been growing personally a lot. I moved through the anger and kind of fit back into the world again as the new person that I'm discovering to be, because I felt a really large gaping loss. It shifted my identity from who I was when he was here to who I was after. It was almost like a BC and AD sort of feeling, because I'm not religious, but he was like my God. He was sort of my everything, and what I knew. So where I am now is, I just still, when I think about him, it takes my breath away. I can't feel the joy part. When I feel it, I immediately get upset again. And I'm just wondering, each process is unique, and this is where I am, and I'm not supposed to compare it to other people grieving, but I'm just like, is this okay? I don't know.
Well, Dana, is it Dana or Dana?
It's Dana.
Okay. Oh, thank you for sharing. I can feel it, There is, I guess, a couple questions for you. 3.5 years in, has the feeling shifted at all, even subtly? Has your relationship to the feeling, or is it just this static pit?
For a while, it was a bit of anger, like I was sort of bulldozing through life, or I was just standing back and just being like, let it wash over. This is all sort of idiocracy. Like, I don't really want to participate. So I was kind of checking in and bulldozing, or I was just checking out, in terms of just the day-to-day things. But whenever I would think of them, I don't know how to explain it. But I usually wouldn't go too far with it because I get upset like this.
Do you ever let yourself just really let it go and not police yourself, not ram anything? How often do you really let it fly? The emotion.
It usually hits me like in the car. So maybe like, I don't know, once every other week, I just let it.
And do you have safety, friends, family, people around you who can hold this space with you? Or are you getting a lot of cues like, buck up, Dana, let's get moving, Are those coming from you or from outside of you?
There was one friend in the past that was like, oh honey, where are you? Oh, give it, it takes about a year. And you'll get there. And outside, I think also the tolerance, like some people who haven't been through it don't understand. So when I'm still feeling like this years later, they don't know what to do with it, so you just kind of carry it around. Again,
Yeah.
I'm doing better, but I just feel like I think maybe I have to somehow change the story, because I feel like he had a really tough life, and that hurts me.
Well, you just hit on something really, really key, which is changing the story. We put things into these narratives, and then we end up becoming kind of beholden to the narrative. So I don't know what this new narrative could be with you and your dad and your dad's memory, but I guess I would push you to think of it in creative terms. What could it be? What would you like it to be? And maybe the most organizing question of all would be, what would your dad want it to be? And what would dad say to you right now? You're that with us, but I wonder, do you have an answer to that question?
Well, it was a terminal illness that we knew would happen. Mm-hmm. So he kind of just went above and beyond with the time that he had, and he kind of was like this super father to me. Mm-hmm. And he made the most of it. So I know he just wants the best for me, and he wants to support me and be happy and love me and that stuff. I think it's also that when he got sick, when he first told me of his diagnosis when I was a teenager, I took on maybe a caretaking role very early on, and was like, I want to protect him in a way, or I don't know. So I think there's a part of me that just can't, fix it or heal it.
Well, those are two really importantly different things. I don't know if you're going to fix this one. You love him too much, period. And there's no way to make his death fixable. But healing may be a different thing. Healing is a different thing. Finding a way to live with this rather than trying to kind of get it out of you, get it over with. That's a really important frame shift, Donna. And I guess I would push you to really, whether it's through expressive art or writing, is just try to revisit the raw material of your father, your relationship to your father, his death, all of it, and deconstruct a little bit, maybe. Look at all that material and see what's in there. And maybe keep your dad's voice in the mix too, how he might coach you or point you. Because you still have a very active relationship with your dad. If you don't know that already, we can hear it. And so maybe conceiving of this grief as way through is really constructing the relationship with your dad that you want right now, and that he might want or would have wanted or might want still, depending on your belief system. So I would focus there. And to the degree you're willing to, you can teach others. It's hard. As a obviously disabled person, I find myself in the role of having to teach people. Ostensibly, I'm the one who lost something, but I'm the one who has to teach people how to manage the site of my loss.
Yeah.
That's not, you don't have to do that, but I would encourage you to have someone on your inner circle, to spend some time with one or two people who are close in and coach them on this a little bit. So that you don't have to feel lost in the company of others, which can be so lonely making. And then oops, sorry.
Oh, I really like the idea of constructing the relationship.
Yeah, there for you. You got carte blanche, in a way, So thinking about this in creative terms, for me, it's like thinking of this in terms of love can really unlock different parts of me. And again, the idea here is to find a way to live with this, not get over it. The get over it language is just terrible and not possible, not really even desired. Get over what? Get over your father? You wouldn't want to do that.
Well,
So,
can I ask you another question?
sure.
I mean, it's kind of personal, but do you still get upset about your sister?
Yeah, I do. I'm smiling because I had this very delayed. I really rammed myself back into life. I really immediately was caregiving for my parents in this because ostensibly their pain was bigger than mine. Blah blah blah. I could go on and on, but I squashed it for a long time and thought that's what, and I was rewarded for that. I thought that was the strong response. Blah blah blah. And then bit by bit the pain kind of oozed out over the years, and I felt, maybe I don't know how many years into, it's been 20 years now, but several years after Lisa's death was when I really actually started to finally feel the pain. It took me a long time to even feel the pain in a real way, and then longer still to consider what I should do with this pain. And then it was only recently, because this is a slow process for me, it's really only recently that I can think of her and actually imagine her. Before I would think of her, I would see it was like a black monolith, this black kind of hole, this black space, this empty space. It was hard for me to even summon her image, because the second I did, I felt horrible and I felt guilty and I felt regret. And now I'm to a point where I can actually picture her, and I can picture her smiling at me. I can picture her crying. I can picture all sorts of things, and I can picture her with me. And that's in the last couple of years. I'm 20 years in, so I'm a very late bloomer. But my point here is, yeah, this is active for a long, long time, as long as you're around, at least. And so there's, in some ways, it's never too late.
Thank you so much for this.
Okay, thank you for your honesty. All right, guys, I'm going to cut back over to the questions. Sonia, you jump in anytime where there's more hands coming up.
Sounds good.
Okay. Oh, Peter, hi. Okay. Any suggestions for rituals a la Dia de los Muertos that are helpful for working with grief and reshaping relationships with death and dying? Well, yeah, and this question must come in similarly to the one above. I need to really actually go study this, because there are rituals out there. There are things that have been done. Again, this is ancient stuff. And I wish I had a more facile response to these good questions. So one is a key for me to go poking around some more. But Dia de los Muertos is a big one, the Day of the Dead. Right there is a huge one to tap into. If you come to the Mission District in San Francisco, you can experience Dia de los Muertos. But the whole idea, the whole premise is, rather than trying to shut out this obnoxious thing, because ostensibly the guy's gone, so I got to move on. This thing needs to get out of my frame of view. The opposite experience here is no. Expanding your frame of reference to include the loss, include the death, and then work with it, play with it, fight it, to do any, laugh at it, decorate it. It doesn't matter so much. The idea is to have some sort of relationship with the loss in an active way, not like a relationship with the past, an active present relationship. I think that's the potency, especially with something like Dia de los Muertos, to the degree I understand that tradition. So I wish I had better answers for you, but it's a good cause for all of us to go talk to our anthropology friends and sociology friends and just pay attention. I think one of the great cues into a culture is, how do they handle aging? How do they handle death? How do they handle loss? Besides just instructive for us, it's also just downright fascinating. So there's a lot waiting for us. I hope to have better answers to these good questions down the road. So moving on to the next question here. Society expects you to get over grief. My grief is a real active relationship that never ends. We need people to accept that it's uncomfortable, messy, and doesn't go away. Well, amen. If I could share your first name, Leslie, safely. Amen. This is like, honestly, guys, these days in particular, if we had to name one muscle to exercise that could help us through, I really believe it would be grief. That is the way we can relate. We can craft a sense of reality that's big enough to hold things like death and loss. And if we can craft that reality, we can craft a reality that really is big enough to hold everybody. We're in such divisive times. I think grief would allow us to reground and find that common ground that we all share across culture, across wealth, across sex, across everything, even across species. So amen to your point here, Leslie. I honestly think for each of us, developing our own ways to grieve, but then as a group, as society, accepting grief, not just accepting with it, but even reveling in it, because it means we love, it means we care, and it adds significance to our relationships. We're not just two people like cosmic dust who happen to bump into each other and that's it, and on we go. No, we're much more interesting critters than that. So I love your point. I think this is the way forward for society right now. I hope, I hope this enters politics. I hope grieving is something that we can talk about openly and actively make space for. I hope that societies make public artworks to connote grief, to honor grief, to have a place to hold loss. We'd all be so much better off because no one's going to escape grief. So amen. Thank you. Next question here. I find myself getting angry at things lately. I have no patience. I'm sure this is common. I've had 2 losses this summer alone, but it doesn't feel good to find everything frustrating. Yeah, I hear you, Justine. Well, I do hear you. This is why in our comments and when Max and I were talking a moment ago, I think it's helpful to realize that those who are in grief are in a way in a more truthful place, a bigger place, a more exquisite place. So if you feel these projections from others to like, hey, come get out of that space and join us in our restricted, divided world, resist it. I know it's easy to say, but resist it. You are in a way, better place. Better because it doesn't kick anything out. It doesn't kick anybody out. That's why it's better. You don't have to be divided here. So all I can say is let's kind of work towards a better society. This is an indictment of society on some level. And with anger's tough. I mean, I think it's important that if you find yourself lashing out, that you circle back and say, hey, I'm sorry, I wasn't angry at you for blah, blah, blah. I'm really reacting to my dad's death or whatever it is. I think communication is really, really, really key here. But it's not surprising that you're angry at this time. And it's not surprising you have no patience. These are really, really difficult times. And I guess my last thought here is, besides just noting it, is to say that the goal here isn't to feel good. I mean, this is another sort of frenzy and fetish of our society, is that it's all about feeling good. No, the idea here is to build out our capacity to feel anything, even everything. Let's not make an enemy of hard feelings. It's not like if we conquer grief, then we don't have to deal with those pesky hard feelings. No, the idea is to welcome grief so that we have a bigger capacity to handle hard feelings. Hard, easy, comfortable, those are our adjectives. Those feelings just exist. There doesn't need to be a hierarchy to them. So if that helps at all, there you go, Justine. Those are some thoughts. Another here. When you talk about grief in terms of metabolizing loss, I'm reminded of a line from Donald Hall's memoir about losing his wife, the poet Jane Kenyon. Quote is, "It was long before every cell in my body believed in her death." Right? So magical thinking is a phrase here, where you find yourself talking. I still talk to my dog, Vermont, who died almost 18 years ago. Right, there's some part of my body that just doesn't buy it, doesn't believe it. And some of that we might sort of castigate or name as magical thinking. In other words, we're altered, we're having these illusions. But I also think that caution from Donald Hall is really also about knowing that, no, I think a reason why I still can't quite accept the loss of my sister or my dog is because in some ways they're not lost. In some ways there really are. There are cells in my body that still have active relationship, like we were talking. So it's not just magical thinking, which is a very normal thing in grief. You can go on for all sorts of lengths of time. Or again, where you're responding to a reality that others can't see or share. But I think I take that also to be a pointing inward, because Donald Hall loved Jane Kenyon, and Jane Kenyon is still alive in Don Hall. So the idea of accepting that she's gone, part might be because she's not. So, all right. Okay, there's some lovely comments. Thank you, guys. Here's one. I'm actively grieving for a loved one and have been incredibly grateful to the few people who have gone out of their way to drop off flowers or simply to say they are sorry for my loss. I say few because it seems to me that right now, during a time of huge grief, everyone is distracted by their own issues and don't take notice of an individual situation. What are some of the ways you have seen kindness expressed to people in grief? Well, Susanna, thank you. You've noted it already. Flowers. I'm sorry for your loss. I mean, some people, sneeze at those words as being sort of pat. But I don't say any words pat here. I don't think there are words for this place really. Poets might have the best access to it, but probably painters or musicians might have the easiest way of expressing this stuff. So I'm sorry for your loss is where I sit is perfectly fine. I think what really helps me is when someone doesn't run away from me or any part of me. When someone can authentically just share the awkwardness. Very often it's awkward. I don't know what to say. I'm not sure what they need to hear. And so I'll talk myself out of even trying. And then, oh, hey, good to see you. And we don't touch this issue that's right under the surface. And sometimes ostensibly I'll watch myself rationalize that. It's like, oh, they don't want, they just want to act normal. They don't want me to bring it up. Well, that's generally not true. And you can also say a lot with your eyes or a hand on the shoulder. It doesn't necessarily need to be words, but one way or another, not running away from each other. And I mean that sometimes physically, but I really mean that emotionally. I think this is where we're being called to build out our capacity. And for me, it's very helpful to remember that compassion, for me to feel something on behalf of somebody else, is endless. Where I start getting squirrely is when I make the mistake that, oh, I'm supposed to do something. I'm supposed to make this all better. I'm supposed to fix it or whatever else. Then I feel pressure and that feels impossible. And then I get squirrely. But I just remind myself it costs nothing for me to feel something. I have an endless supply of feeling. So teasing out compassion and just actually feeling something on someone's behalf, because I believe that registers, whether it's through vibes or a word or a flower, I believe it registers somewhere in our person. And honoring that, I mean, just loving the feeling. It doesn't, so folks who are around people in grief shouldn't feel like they need to fix it or do something. Just feel something. These days, really feeling something on behalf of another person is a kind of, I think of it as a kind of activism. It's almost revolutionary anymore. So those are some thoughts, Susanna. And I think, each of us here on this call can begin to kind of lead this way. But I think daring to feel is the start. Let's see here. Jenny, I was afraid I wouldn't survive my sister's death, and I didn't. All my built-up deference that I thought was me shattered. Now all my deficits, maybe, are gone, and I'm just me. Vulnerable, creative, happy, grateful. It took me 3 years. I just want to share this with people in new grief. Jenny, that's beautiful. I think one of the most, it's a little bit relates to Susanna's question, and Dana's comments too. I think one of the things I resisted with Lisa's death was being changed, being affected. And I've come to realize that being affected is one of the most beautiful ways to honor anything. If you really want to honor life, be moved by it, be affected by it, let it flow through you, let it change you. Around deathbeds that I've worked at, the folks who find a way, it can be beautiful when someone sort of hangs on to themselves through to the end, themselves as this self that is understood and they project and people communicate and see and get. Okay. But I have to say I have a bias towards, I see when people let themselves be changed and let themselves be shattered. What a beautiful response to something, letting ourselves be overwhelmed. In other words, letting life be bigger than this little old body, because it is. So there's some real great truth in being affected and dying yourself in this way, letting old roles, old narratives go, clearing space and writing some new ones. So thank you, Jenny. Okay, guys, let's see here. Any other questions coming up, Sonia? I'm gonna keep going down the, I'm sorry, any other hands up?
It doesn't look like it, so I think we can just keep going through the questions.
All right. Here from Heather, please share thoughts on disenfranchised grief and social inequality. Yeah, okay, well, big one right now. A lot of us are, loneliness is a scourge, and extra so during the pandemic. And so a lot of us are suffering in isolation as individuals. A lot of us, I mean, that is separated one from another. We're literally isolated as ourselves. Many of us are isolated from parts of ourselves internally. And then there are groups of us who are structurally, systematically disenfranchised, a truth that is becoming more and more obvious. So this is where I think there's potential for grief to heal these divides, because it is something that crosses people of every stripe. But besides that sort of social activism, besides the sort of aspiration that grief would be one of the grounding mechanisms by which we reacquaint ourselves with each other and with ourselves, I think it's really important to also note that there's, if I am part of a group of people that has been systematically disenfranchised, and in some ways I suppose I have been as a disabled person, well, there's that compounds the loss, but it also, there's also something to be said for when I am talking with other disabled people, we have something to share between us. And we also have something to sort of team up and deal with. So I think part of my thinking here, Heather, would be, besides what I've already said, would be that being disenfranchised as a group, it can be a bond within that group. It can allow for a group think about how do we want to present ourselves to the world? How do we need to get what we want? Or how do we get what we need? And do that as a team, do that as a group. That sounds like a pathetic response, but I'm just looking for a toehold to stop the free fall. And I think we also have to realize, let's just talk openly here for a second about the issues of race, for example, and the history of racial inequality in this country is shocking and embarrassing and enormous. And I, as a white person, as a white male, I have to say, I have, over the years, the impulse may be, oh, okay, yeah, sorry about that, right, I see, yes, okay, yes, you've been disenfranchised. Okay, well, now you're not, right? Let's move on. No, not that easy. There's so much trauma that is still active and still in the bones of folks that have been left out. So I think one thing that we all need to do as a society, and I hope this happens at the political level, is I really think there needs to be a time of sort of a national mourning time, a truth and reconciliation process. It's not okay to just start present forward. Okay, that's the past, this is the present. Let's just build a new country, a new way of being. There's going to need to be a transition where we note all these losses and all this pain, and we allow each other to feel it. That would be my great hope, is that we structure this a period, a truth and reconciliation, where we come to terms with the emotional load of the past before we move on. So those are some thoughts, Heather, but boy, I need to learn a lot, and we all do on this one. Phil, why do you think some experiences of pain loss harden and close people off, while other experiences of pain loss soften and open people up? Well, great question. There's a sort of a razor's edge here, where loss can lead to growth and expansion, or loss can crush us and lead to contraction, shutting down. So what's the difference? I'm sure it's not a difference, but one is that's been a subtext of a lot of our conversation here, is that we as a people, as society, haven't made space for this. And so if I'm in pain, dealing with loss, and I look around me, and there's no place for that. I can't see it in other people's faces. There's no structure waiting for me. There are no groups or no conversations like ours. Then I'm going to receive the signal that I'm an anomaly. There's something wrong with me. And that's when I start contracting. That's when I start shrinking. So I think a major part of that razor here really is, how do we as a group handle this with each other? You know, if I can feel, if I am supported through my loss, then I can be loved and held while I go through it. And then I can know that there's still a place for me in this world. And then I can start getting creative and see, what do I want to learn from that pain? What do I want to learn from that loss? But all that is facilitated by really a response to myself, which really is facilitated by response of others to me. So I think what all of us can do here is to be a little bit better at being there for people who are in active loss or having pain. And being there, again, it can just be an emotional, just holding a little bit of emotional space for them. It doesn't need to be a big thing, but that might help.
Right, we're almost at 11 here, and I know people have, other meetings and other fun things to do, but we do still have a few really great questions. So I think since this is our first time and we're still kind of learning, I think we're gonna go ahead, we'll record answers to your other questions, and we'll post them alongside this whole video. So you will get an email with a link to both of them, because we do want to get to all these questions because they're really great comments and queries. So we'll make sure that those are answered and sent out to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, so do we have time for one more? Or should we close it, do you guys think? What do you think, Sonia?
I think since we're at 11, and I want to respect people's schedules, but of course,
Okay,
if you can answer one quickly.
Sorry. I know you just said, but then I asked you again, sorry. I just want to say there's a comment in here that sort of brings us around a little bit together to the end here, to a way to encapsulate this. And how to frame, feeling guilty that we should feel a different way, or feeling guilty that we're not feeling what others seem to want us to feel. I will just, as a closing comment, I think one of the things that this experience of grief can point us to is the need, yes, the need of us as being social creatures and being in love with the world around us. But I think because we're so, as a society, so behind in particular, but maybe always, I think one of the things to pull us through here as individuals is we have to be our own judge and jury. But we are the ones who get to say what grief is. We are the ones who say what we feel. And feelings, the nature of feelings versus thoughts is that you can't control them. So there really should be no such thing as feeling guilty for our feelings. They are what they are. What we can do is try to own them. It's hard to do, but I guess that would be my encapsulating thing, is for us to own our pain. And as soon as we do, to own our feelings, whatever they are, as soon as we do, they tend to not be quite as obnoxious, and we tend to have a little bit more facility with what to do with them. So that's a final thought for us today. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for participating in this very first one. We'll do others, and besides posting other comments and questions, if you guys have other ideas of how this could work a little bit better or differently, please let us know, or any other content, subject matter you'd like us to lean into, let us know. Just be in touch. But I can't thank you guys enough for attending this first one and kicking us off so kindly, and for sharing. I really appreciate it. My final thought would be, we just brought up a lot of tough, hard stuff, exquisite stuff. So I would just encourage all of us to, for the rest of the day at least, just be real patient and really kind. We might find ourselves in a little bit of a little mood shift because we're bringing all this stuff up. So be kind, and thank you again. All right. Bye-bye for now, guys.